Active History is pleased to present a recording of Dan Samson's talk, Cosmopolitanism in James Barrie's Diary, The Atlantic World Views of a 19th Century Nova Scotia Miller. The talk was delivered on April 22, 2017, as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here today. I gave a proposal to give a paper that was going to do two things. It was going to talk about an ordinary person's take on Confederation. And it was going to situate that, I guess it was going to do three things. It was going to situate that in the broader intellectual world of a Presbyterian dissenter in the 19th century. But I was going to tell you how he didn't care a damn about Confederation. I made that proposal before I'd gotten to 1867 in the diary. And when we get to 1867, James Barrie is pissed. So it's actually quite a different conclusion that I'm going to be offering here, but I'll still give you that same basic picture. This is James Barrie's farm and mill in 6 Mile Brook, Pictou County, Nova Scotia. This is a photo taken in the 1930s, but you get some sense of what it is. Substantial Victorian house. He's a fairly prosperous man. You see the mill, you see the dam, you see the mill pond here in the background. 6 Mile Brook is a tiny place. If you go there today, you're lost. It's nothing. It's literally nothing. I actually, if you're really interested, I have a Google Earth slide at the end of this that I can show you, but it's basically a strip of highway, and you can faintly see a river through the trees. But it's a tiny little place. It's off the West River, but what I'm going to suggest to you here is that when we think of James Barrie's world in 6 Mile Brook, we're missing a lot. We should probably think of James Barrie's world as something more like this. And I'll just point out, I don't have my pointer here, but I'll point out that 6 Mile Brook flows into the West River. The West River flows into Pictou Harbor. Pictou Harbor flows into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That flows into the Atlantic Ocean. And Edinburgh, Glasgow, Princeton, Philadelphia are just boatloads of books away. And that's kind of the point that I'm going to get at here. So I'm going to begin here. Really quickly. The diary, over 6,000 pages, 56-year diary, great source. From an historian's perspective, lovely because the handwriting is clear. Filled with amusing little drawings every once in a while like this. He's building a shed out back. He nicely draws it for us. I love this. I didn't mean this, but it captures a bit of his personality as well. You can see the top diary entry, Donald Gunn, a lazy little curse. And he is a cranky man. This is one of the defining features of James Barrie. He's an irritable person. Many of you will have seen this quotation before. It shows up in anthologies on Confederation, showing Nova Scotia, both the pro and anti-camp, and this is a pro position. This is from the Colonial Standard, a Pictou newspaper, very conservative Pictou newspaper. And it nicely captures spirit, and really works nicely for Barrie. Should some old pamphlet or bundle of newspapers of the present day or a diary, find its way into some old chest packed away and forgotten in some cellar or attic, which is exactly what happened with Barrie's diary, should its resurrection 200 or 300 years or 150 years hence disclose the truth that there were actually people in 1867 who poured out their wretched tirades against this union and that talked of it as selling the rights and liberties of Nova Scotia, they could scarcely believe their eyes. It is difficult to realize it even now. That's on July 2nd, 1867. 3 days earlier, James Barrie had written in his diary, "Tomorrow we will be swallowed up in the Dominion of Canada. Nova Scotia will become a province of Canada, and Canadians will rule and suck the lifeblood out of it. Damn Toryism, say I." And so that's really, I'm just wanting to pick up on this, and I want to explore kind of the intellectual basis for Barrie's position. So, Nova Scotia's position in Confederation, well known. The kind of traditional position on the historiography of Nova Scotian Confederation often reduces the pros and the cons to your position in your economy. Sometimes there's a kind of tribal, factional discussion of religion, although certainly we just heard a much more nuanced take on that for sure, certainly the Catholic dimension of that. But in this discussion, I want to shift into the realm of culture, in particular of book culture and of religion. So not to look at religion as faction, not to look at religion as a kind of political position, but religion as political theology. Theological political culture or something like that. Barry's politics aligned with a major stream of anti-Confederation thinking in Nova Scotia, and it drew on a rich vein of dissenting church resistance to the imposition of the larger political forces. This was not religious tribalism. It was not sad rural provincialism, which it often is portrayed as in some of the older central Canadian accounts of this. It is, in fact, a thoughtful, careful, and considered position. It drew on decades of popular dissenting Presbyterian resistance to larger political forces, and it nicely shows up in Barry's position. The longer version of this paper has an extensive discussion kind of situating in the bigger, broader world of Scottish Presbyterianism and political dissent and intellectual debate, but I'll just leave that at kind of a simple position that I think most of us know, that it spills over into all kinds of liberal reform positions, abolition of slavery, to public school policy, all kinds of 19th century liberal causes, and I'll leave that there. It is important, though, perhaps to note the connection to the role of atonement in Presbyterian theology, and that really gets at that issue of free will on the choice of salvation, highlighting a voluntarist basis for Christianity. Faith was an expression of free will, and so too was government. And again, we see this very clearly in Barry's position. So Barry is a miller. We saw that. He's a printer. You're not going to see that in this discussion. He's a fiddler. You're not going to see that either, although there's an additional 6,000 pages of fiddle tunes recorded. So he's an amazing dimension of him right there alone. And but also an iconoclastic dissenting Presbyterian and a man who purchased a lot of books. He's also a Morrisonian. Most people don't know what Morrisonians were. They still exist, actually. But they're a particularly radical Presbyterian sect who effectively believed in an absolute purity of congregationalism. There was really no hierarchy in this church whatsoever, and certainly were radical Democrats in their approach to most politics in Scotland. And of the 20 or so that existed in Canada in the 19th century, they too adhered to this position. But I don't want to put too much emphasis on that. This applies to Barry, but I'm going to suggest that there's a broader pattern here. Barry never traveled more than 20 miles beyond 6 Mile Brook. He never attended preaching, never went to church, never joined the many church-based temperance or missionary groups that marked Pictou Presbyterianism. And for those of you who don't know much about Nova Scotia, Presbyterianism in Pictou very much defines the politics of the place. It really is a disputational center in Nova Scotia. He lived a devout life, Bible reading, theological debate with neighbors, persistent criticism of those neighbors, criticisms of their hypocrisies and of their erroneous beliefs. And most of them are dissenting Presbyterians themselves. He's just an extremist. But he's not isolated, and that's kind of the key here. Books gave Barry a cosmopolitan view. I had to get cosmopolitan into the paper here. A view of the centers of religious and intellectual debate of the mid-19th century Atlantic world. Confederation marks one of the few sustained engagement with politics. He often makes comments on things, but he seldom has a sustained engagement with these kinds of topics. And what we see in the diary over the course of the roughly 5 years between Charlottetown and Howe's accommodation with Sir John A. We see regular discussions of the leading figures. He subscribes to 3 newspapers, all of them liberal reformist newspapers, all of them anti-Confederate. He talks about the major figures. He talks about Howe, who interestingly calls him the great moving object, which is interesting. No, but that phrase turns up in a lot of abolitionist discussions, and it turns up in a lot of dissenting Presbyterian critiques of both the Church of Scotland and the Church of England. So it is this kind of phrase that he seems to have borrowed. Describes Tupper as a servile Tory. Most people are servile Tories to him. And attends numerous meetings, debates, read much of the anti-Confederation literature, the stuff I talk about in the paper at some length. And discussed it with his neighbors on trips to the market towns nearby of Pictou, Durham, New Glasgow, and so on. And when you read the diary, it's pretty clear. You get a sense of a vibrant political culture in this community, one marked by engaged discussion and a variety of viewpoints. And it's particularly clear, too, from his denunciation of his neighbors that there's no clear local consensus on how to think about Confederation. Berry said lots in support of Martin Wilkins. Wilkins is one of the two MLAs for Pictou County, both of whom are liberal reformers. And Wilkins' writings, he writes quite a bit. They appeared regularly in the anti-Confederation newspapers, and he published one well-known, anti-Confederate pamphlet from the time. If you compare Wilkins' writings, which are pretty extensive and pointed, with Berry, you see some patterns emerging. Both of them, for example, highlight use of the word tyrannical. And this may be Berry borrowing from Wilkins, but certainly they both use this term tyrannical in terms of describing Britain forcing Nova Scotia to join the Canadian colonies. Both men, for example, also talked about a couple of times parallels between Nova Scotia and the Southern Confederacy in the United States being deprived of their liberty by a larger despotic force. And both, too, saw that separation from the British Empire was a logical outcome of what's happening with Britain's overextending its reach in Confederation. Berry's greater influences, however, came from books and from the Presbyterian literary world those books connected him with. Even in his local community, the ideas of the Atlantic world circulated widely and fostered discussion. Berry bought lots of books and he loaned them to his friends. He also borrowed books from others. These often formed the basis of discussions, and discussions that are far more sophisticated than we might imagine in such a rural and remote locale. Religion and history are two of the most important common themes in Berry's reading, and religion in particular dominates. What he emphasizes are particularly Presbyterian books and those many sectarian dispute Presbyterian books that are being published from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. He's reading Robert Fleming, he's reading Jonathan Edwards, he's reading American Presbyterians like Archibald Alexander and Samuel Miller, who are founding figures in Princeton, at Princeton Theological School. It's fair to say that the broadly disputatious dimensions of Presbyterianism in general and dissenting Presbyterianism in particular lent a decidedly reformist, sometimes anti-statist dimension to his reading. These liberal reform views are evident in Berry's positions on two of the major issues of the mid-19th century Atlantic world, abolition and the U.S. Civil War. And I'm really cutting down here, but just to give you a flavor of some of the evidence here, in neither case did he have an awful lot to say about them, but he expressed clear sympathies with the oppressed. I say, confound the oppressors, in capital letters, wherever they may be found, and let the oppressed go. Now, ironically, he's speaking about the U.S. South here, and seeming missing the irony in what he's saying, but he does make similarly strong statements about slavery as well. But for him, it's this kind of consistent position of looking at a situation and seeing who's in control and who's forcing somebody else to do something. This is the consistency that he brings to his analysis of situations. Such positions on slavery and political oppression were common in dissenting Presbyterian circles, but particularly so in the radical Morrisonian sect to which Berry claimed adherence. Morrisonians' belief in universal atonement emphasized free will, individual autonomy, and minimal government. They were so autonomous in their congregational governance that they were denied entry into the breakaway Free Church Presbyterians when they left the Church of Scotland in 1843. Rejecting any kind of centralized authority in church governance, they were radically democratic in both spiritual and political spheres. Much like the Princeton Theological Institute fellows, they maintained that these dimensions of faith also extended to the secular world. Human government, like church membership, had to be by consent. So in the 5 years between the Charlottetown Conference and Howe's accommodation, Berry discussed Confederation 66 different times. Some of them are fairly brief, some of them are fairly extensive. They're diary entries, so none of them are particularly extensive. But you do get a clear sense of his thinking from those entries and from the broader context both of his life and what we can see around him on the West River. On some occasions, he offered what we might call Presbyterian observations, in that they emphasize the exercise of free will. So, for example, Berry always had between 1 and 3 men working in his mills, at least 1 housekeeper, often 2, and usually 1 or 2 men working around the property doing general labor of some sort. In late July of 1867, however, he could not find any men to work, a condition he attributed directly to the bribes offered to local workers by conservatives attempting to buy votes for Confederation. Corruption generally, and bribery particularly offended Barry's sense of free will. This was not petty political corruption, but the kind of soul-destroying corruption that always attended, as he called them, scheming plans. Later in September, and following the crushing defeat of the pro-Confederation government in the provincial election, Barry knew why Confederation had lost so decisively. Let them take that as a lesson for their trampling on the rights of Nova Scotia and selling them off to Canada against their will. Here too, Barry frames the issue in terms of the issues that he understood best, that a true Protestant, a true dissenting Presbyterian. Toryism, he continued, is a curse in politics, just as Catholicism is in religion. They both want to rule independently of the people. So these kind of voluntarist themes are really much at the core of Barry's critique of Confederation. This sense of Catholics and Tories imposing rule on the people, denying them their free will, was the key point for Barry. Most of his major criticism related to the general injustice of Nova Scotia being forced against their will to join the new country. On 7 separate occasions, Barry decried Confederation as being imposed against our wills. And in some cases, depending on the circumstances, it was Britain imposing. In other cases, it was Canadians imposing. But in all cases, it was Tories acting. Barry railed endlessly against Tories, be they Britons, Nova Scotians, his neighbors, or his wife. And you're not going to hear that story today, but more to come. The language he employs is of servility, slavery, and persecution. It was the language of a dissenting Presbyterian decrying involuntary government. We know very little about how non-elite individuals felt about the major questions of British North American affairs, and much less still about Confederation. Social history in Canada generally has been much better telling us about the patterns of ordinary people's lives than it has been of their individual hopes and dreams, their beliefs and prejudices. A fuller sense of Barry's hopes and dreams and his prejudices are beyond this essay, but we can situate his politics on this very important question in this moment in Canadian history. We can see that James Barry was an ordinary man, a miller, in a small settlement in colonial Nova Scotia. We can see that he lived on a brook, off a river, off a harbor, off a gulf, across an ocean from the centers of the North Atlantic world, but that through books, reading, and debate and discussion, he actively participated in the major intellectual and political currents of his day. We can see that he was part of a node in a transatlantic religious book culture, one centered in Edinburgh, London, and Princeton, with links in Halifax, Pictou, and 6 Mile Brook. We can see that he carried its views into discussions that animated the intellectual world of rural Pictou County. We can see that in his reading, in his discussions, in his views on abolition, on the Civil War, on Confederation, that he brought ideas and practices, dimensions of what historian John Fea terms the rural enlightenment, to bear in ways that we might miss in the speeches Barry might have heard in Barrie or Mount Tom, or that others would have heard in Halifax or St. John. And we can see that a critical feature of these ideas and practices were noted in his theological understandings of government and free will. James Barry was a deeply pious Christian man, one with flaws that hurt himself and his family. That's what you're not hearing, but one who understood virtue to come from reading in general and from the Bible in particular. He was a man who understood that his salvation and his political position were connected through his free will. He was very much in the tradition of radical Democrats whose piety and democratic sensibilities were closely entwined. Last paragraph. Barry also can help us think through dimensions of the historiography on Confederation. He undoubtedly would have agreed with Phil Buckner's suggestion that the fathers were not Democrats. Conversely, he would certainly have spat fiery words on hearing Janet Agenstadt's views on the democratic heart of Confederation. Most importantly, I think, Barry allows us to see that what Buckner terms the populist dimension of the maritime anti-Confederate protests was at least in part grounded in what we might term a theo-political culture. That this wasn't merely about railroads or markets or tribal arrangements. It was about a powerfully rooted understanding of voluntarism. Modern liberal Democrats might also allow that our sense of liberalism and democracy is no doubt more narrowly conceived than this 19th century evangelicals. Barry's liberalism certainly held that kind of Lockean dimension that Ian Mackay suggests defined Canada's emerging liberal order. And yet the Miller's liberalism, his sense of the basis for his freedom, of his free will, stemmed at least as much from his anti-burgher church politics as from his emergent bourgeois property-owning business orientation. And so while it's important to acknowledge that Barry was in many ways atypical, he is atypical, it's equally important to acknowledge that many among Nova Scotia's broader dissenting evangelical world of Baptists, Methodists, and evangelical Anglicans may have been influenced similarly, and thus also saw Nova Scotia's underdog place in the new federation in much the same way. Thank you.
You've been listening to a recording of Dan Samson's talk, Cosmopolitanism in James Barrie's Diary, the Atlantic World Views of a 19th Century Nova Scotia Miller. The talk was delivered on April 22nd, 2017 as part of the Other 60s, the decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca, and be sure to subscribe to the History Chats podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts.